Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the enormous privilege of serving as the president of Hunter College, where, whether online or in person, the American dream continues to come true. Tonight it is my pleasure to welcome you from wherever you may be joining to the 10th installment of Hunter at Home. Let me start by sending my best wishes to you and all your loved ones as we continue life under the constraints of COVID-19 crisis. I sincerely hope that you and your families are staying safe and healthy. When we began the Hunter at Home online series a little over a month ago, our goal was to help our Hunter community stay connected during the adjustment to remote learning and social distancing. I am happy to report that is exactly what has happened. Hunter at Home events have provided a special meeting place for the Hunter family and beyond, a source of intellectual stimulation, crucial information, and cultural reprieve. Just like a certain enormous magical mammal who will co-star in this evening's very special program, we humans of Hunter are social creatures, and we prefer to be together in person. But through these Hunter at Home programs that we have created, it's the next best thing, the intellectual and creative power of the Hunter faculty right in your own home. So let me introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Joshua Plotnick. Dr. Plotnick is one of the stars of the Hunter College Psychology Department and teaches in one of the most exciting and innovative programs at Hunter, the Animal Behavior and Conservation Program. This exciting program trains the professionals who serve in our city zoos, conservation societies, and animal care institutions. A recent graduate, the actor and filmmaker Isabella Rossellini, credited the program with inspiring a whole new chapter of life and work, starting with her thesis project, an acclaimed one-woman, one-dog show about animal behavior called Link Link Circus. Dr. Plotnick is among the pioneers in a growing field within psychology known as comparative cognition, which studies the evolution of intelligence across species, and he is widely considered one of the world's foremost experts on elephant cognition. His research has been featured everywhere from ABC News to the BBC, which last year called on his expertise to help address the question of whether elephants risk their lives to save each other. About a year ago, the New York Times covered Dr. Plotnick's groundbreaking work on the elephant's ability to smell. Dr. Plotnick won't be alone in tonight's program. As he concludes his presentation on the research he has been doing over the last 13 years, he will be joined in a very special live virtual meeting by the elephants of the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation in Chiang Rai, Thailand. In case you had any doubt, tonight's program provides some evidence that virtual programs with the ability to include people or animals from across time zones anywhere in the world do have their advantages. Let's just say it would have been a challenge to fit these particular guests in FDR's elevator at Roosevelt House, or even through the stage door at the Kay Playhouse Theater at Hunter. As citizens and scientists across the globe fight to contain the coronavirus outbreak, it is more important than ever that we learn to live in harmony rather than harmfully with the natural world. Let this crisis become a wake-up call for how we as humans treat this planet, its natural wonders, and its animals. Sadly, elephants are becoming endangered around the world, but as Dr. Plotnick will show, a better understanding of elephant behavior may be a difference maker in the ongoing efforts to protect them. As the largest land animal on the earth, the elephant occupies not just the place where she stands, but a place in our consciousness as one of the earth's most mesmerizing and enchanting beings. For ages, poets, philosophers, and scientists have been drawn to and inspired by their majesty. 16th century English poet John Donne called elephants, quote, nature's great masterpiece, the only harmless great thing. Sometime later, Dr. Seuss wrote, quote, I meant what I said and I said what I meant, an elephant's faithful 100%. Something elephants have in common with the students, faculty, donors, and alumni of Hunter College. And children's book author Jennifer Richard Jacobson observed that, quote, elephants love reunions. They recognize one another after years and years of separation and greet each other with wild, boisterous joy. There's bellowing, trumpeting, and ear flapping. Well, I look forward to much bellowing, trumpeting, and ear flapping when the time comes for all of us to be together in person again at Hunter College. Until then, I'm thrilled to present you another installment of Hunter at Home. As the great educator Randy Poosh once said, when there's an elephant in the room, introduce him. With that, thank you to the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation in Thailand and its director, John Roberts, who has helped make this extraordinary event possible. Joshua, thank you so much for speaking to us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshua Plotnick.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, President Raab, for this honor of being able to bring elephants into your homes this evening during this very difficult time. My name is Joshua Plotnick, and I've been studying elephants in US zoos, northern Thailand's captive elephant facilities, and central Thailand's jungles for more than a decade. It has been a privilege to work with these intelligent and majestic animals. And tonight, I want to give you an overview with lots of photos and videos of the research on elephant behavior and cognition my students, colleagues, and I have been conducting for more than a decade. But before I get into why we study elephants, I thought I'd briefly say something about how I've gotten to study elephants. One reason to address this is that I've invited a lot of younger students to this talk, and I think it's always a great opportunity for scientists to highlight their career paths so that young people know how diverse paths into science can be. I somehow went from a young child with dreams of chasing tigers through the bush as a field veterinarian to taking 16 Hunter College students this past winter to see elephants for an education abroad trip to Thailand. And here are the students here with our elephants in Thailand. I remember realizing as a college student that medicine wasn't for me, and I had the exciting opportunity to take a summer research experience working with Professor Franz de Waal at Emory University. Several years later, as his PhD student, I had the exciting opportunity to work with him and Professor Diana Rees, now a close colleague of mine at Hunter, on a study looking at whether elephants can recognize themselves in a mirror. They can, I'll show you that in a moment. And I went to Professor de Waal one day and asked him if I could do something different. I wanted to try to set up field sites in Asia studying elephant behavior. Without a second thought, he gave me some funds, his support, and he wished me luck. 15 years later, I am so grateful and honored to be able to work with elephants while teaching and educating students interested in animal behavior. One small fun warning, if you haven't noticed it already, although this is a very difficult time for all of us, one positive experience has been our ability to spend more time with our families. So as I give this talk on elephants from my small apartment in Queens, New York, there's a good chance you'll hear or see my 2-year-old son, who already has a fascination for elephants. So now on to the why we study elephants. Comparative psychologists compare the cognition or intelligence of animals across species. And traditionally, this was done by looking at our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, and other non-human primates. If a chimpanzee shows an ability for tool use or empathy or cooperation, for instance, then it suggests our common evolutionary ancestor with these species likely had this capacity as well. But an exciting new area of research focuses on converging cognitive evolution and suggests that evolutionarily distant animals like crows, dolphins, elephants, or dogs may show similarities in intelligence because of similarities in the environmental pressures they faced in their evolution. Perhaps the need to use tools to get access to food or to overcome an environmental obstacle, or the need to cooperate with family members in order to get food or to avoid predators led to similarities in intelligence that cannot be explained by commonality in ancestry. I got interested in elephants because we've heard how smart they are, but remarkably, we know relatively little about them from a scientific perspective. And something that I always find important to emphasize is that even though we all think we know how smart an animal is from anecdotes or stories that we've heard online or from friends, we never really know about them until we actually study these animals. Elephants have incredibly dexterous trunks and live in complex matriarchal, which means female-led family groups, and I thought they would be an excellent test subject for understanding how intelligence might evolve in a big-brained non-primate. But an important point here is that what I learned really quickly was that elephants were exactly that, non-primates. They didn't see the world the same way we do. As you'll see during this talk, they are much better at smelling and hearing the world. So this meant that we had the exciting but difficult task of trying to design experiments that made sense for elephants. If an elephant is presented with a task that a chimpanzee and a human child can solve, is it fair to expect them to be just as good at it as if because the task relies on good eyesight? So hopefully you'll see in this talk that even when a task is visual, we work hard to ensure the elephants have access to other sensory information when and if they need it. I'm also going to talk about how important I think understanding animal behavior and cognition is to aiding in wildlife conservation. How can we understand the conflict between humans and elephants in Asia, for instance, if we don't understand how elephants think and why they make the decisions they do? Conservation strategies that take the human and wildlife perspective, both in terms of how the animals live and how they behave, I think has the best chance of succeeding long term. As someone who studies an endangered species, I feel an obligation to use my research to try to help them. Although this may sound anthropomorphic, because elephants have given so much to me as a scientist, I think it is important that we try to give to them as well. So I'll talk to you this evening a bit about our research, how it has led to both applied conservation in the field, and how we're doing conservation education programs to teach children about elephants in classrooms. The first study I ever did with elephants was at the Bronx Zoo on mirror self-recognition, and this looked at whether elephants have a sense of self. Mirror self-recognition is a demonstration of self-awareness that, although we think exists likely as a continuum in the animal kingdom, may only be expressed as mirror self-recognition in a select few species. Passing the mirror test may indicate that you recognize yourself as separate from others, a potential prerequisite for capacities like empathy or thoughtful cooperation. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Because elephants can do this, I'll show you a video in a moment, I wanted to ask questions about the complexity of their cooperative relationships as well. I'll show you these experiments as well as others I'm currently conducting with colleagues in Asia. I've also been very interested in understanding how best to test elephants by playing to their sensory strengths. How can we test animal intelligence if we don't give them a fair start? So we've also been studying their sensory perception, and in particular, how elephants smell their worlds. I'm then going to talk about the work I'm really excited about, our new field sites in Thailand studying wild elephants, and our application of field cognition research to conservation in practice. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about how research on elephant behavior and cognition can be used to educate the next generation about conservation as well. So let's talk about mirror self-recognition first. The typical mirror self-recognition test is elegant but simple. You expose the animal to a mirror and you see how they respond to it. Most animals show social behavior toward the mirror, treating the mirror image as if it was a stranger, and interestingly, never do anything beyond this. A few species eventually start to test the mirror image with repetitive movements in and out of mirror view, as if they're asking themselves, why is that animal doing the same thing that I'm doing? And then we usually start to see self-directed behavior, looking at parts of the body you can't see without the mirror, looking inside the mouth, self-grooming. But this is all subjective in the sense that the experimenter only interprets the behavior they are seeing as social or self-directed. To confirm this with experiments, we perform a mark test. And this test was originally designed by an Albany psychologist, Gordon Gallup, where the animal is marked conspicuously on one side of their head. The idea being that if they recognize themselves, they should reach up and touch the visible mark in front of the mirror. I usually ask children what they think an elephant might do if they don't recognize themselves, and the answer is that if they think it's another animal, perhaps they might reach out and touch the mirror. To date, very few species have passed this test. The species thus far are the great apes, so chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangs, and us, magpies, which is one species of corvid, dolphins, and elephants. So this is Pepsi, a 10-year-old bull elephant at the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation in Chiang Rai, Thailand. And there are several controls we do here, I should mention, to make sure that elephants are truly touching the mark because they see themselves in the mirror. But here you can see this 10-year-old is clearly aware that the mirror is a reflection of self. He reaches up and in front of the mirror, touches the white X on his forehead. On the second day of testing, we switch the mark to the other side. And even though he goes to touch the mark and rub it off. It's very humid outside, so this non-toxic non-toxic white face paint that we typically use on Halloween. So even though he goes to eat the non-toxic children's face paint, you see him put it in his mouth. Typically what he's doing here is he's touching the paint to his vomeronasal organ to get a better smell. I think it's pretty clear from this video that Pepsi is interested in the mark and that he recognizes himself. And here at the end, you see a big open mouth where he looks inside. So we find this to be pretty compelling evidence of mirror self-recognition in elephants. This capacity for seeing oneself separate from others got me thinking more about cooperative behavior and led me to my PhD dissertation research. Cooperation is not rare in the animal kingdom. Ants cooperate, honeybees cooperate, lions cooperate to take down a gazelle on the savannah in Africa. But how much of this cooperation is thoughtful or flexible? In other words, how much flexibility is there at the level of the individual to choose partners or to change one's behavior based on the level of cooperation needed? We can actually test this. In this video from a study done more than 80 years ago, 2 chimpanzees are given 2 ropes attached to a heavy box to pull it in from a distance. On the box, of course, are bananas. Although there was some training that went into this study, in terms of training the chimpanzees to pull ropes, you could see that they were coordinating their pulling to get the food. But here we see that one chimpanzee on the right is hungry while the one on the left, not so much. The chimp on the right recruits her partner to participate in pulling, and of course gets most of the food, as you'll see at the end. So you see this recruitment by the chimpanzee reaching out, touching the partner to encourage them to participate, and then she reaches out to get most of the food. This actually suggests that the chimpanzee understood that in order to get access to the food, her partner needed to help. If all she knew was to pull, we might expect her to do that indefinitely, even after repeatedly failing to get the food. So for elephants, we developed a variation of this heavy box task based on a design originally by a Japanese scientist, Satoshi Harada, that didn't require a heavy box. I've seen elephants pull 747 airplanes down runways, and so instead of a heavy box that one elephant couldn't pull, but 2 could, we instead used a pulley-like system with a single rope threaded through and around the table. And if you can see my cursor here, you can see how the rope would be threaded through this table and around so that both ends are available to the elephants. Although we trained the elephants to pull ropes, most of them already knew how from their training in the tourism industry. We never trained them on how to solve the table with a partner. In this video, the elephant on the right has already waited for 45 seconds. I've edited the video for time, and does not pull the rope until her partner arrives. And that allows her to pull in the table with her partner to get access to the corn in the 2 red buckets on the table. In control trials that we ran during this experiment, we also saw that elephants not only learned to wait for their partner to get there before they pulled ropes, but also that if a rope wasn't available to the partner, the elephant soon gave up. This suggests the elephants had some understanding of the need for a partner or that the partner's behavior mattered in the task. I have to say that working with elephants comes with a lot of exciting surprises, especially during experiments. And so here's one of my favorite videos that I think illustrates well how flexible these elephants can be when faced with problem-solving tasks. This video, and it's from a bird's eye view, so a camera above, shows 2 5-year-old female elephants at the Thai Elephant Conservation Center in Lampang, Thailand. As you can see, the table moves towards the elephants because the elephant on the top of the video is pulling, but the elephant on the bottom is not. That's because she learned, and I can't tell you how or when she learned this because she was pulling the rope the same way as the other elephants moments earlier, that she could get the food by simply putting her foot on the rope and letting her partner do all the work. What is she thinking in this moment? We don't know, but this novel behavior that we did not teach her suggests some level of thoughtful cooperation. We are still working on understanding elephant cooperation, of course, and we are now looking at whether elephants form reputations of humans by observing them. For example, we might call this eavesdropping on them when they interact with other elephants. This is research we are doing with a PhD student, Hoi Lam Jim, in Austria at the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation, again in Chiang Rai, a place you will all be visiting with me a little bit later this evening. We're also looking at whether these cooperative relationships break down when the rules of cooperation change or things become more competitive. And it seems from early results, like humans, that in fact does happen. This is work we are doing in Myanmar, formerly Burma, with PhD student Lily Lee from the Shi Huangbana Botanical Garden in Yunnan, China. Stay tuned as these studies are in progress, and I would be happy to talk more about them as the results come out. So now I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about a eureka moment I had while working with a group of elephants and their mahouts, or caretakers. I said earlier that I realized that it didn't make a lot of sense to test elephants on primate-centric tasks when elephants aren't particularly visual animals. But they did well on the mirror and the cooperation tests, which are certainly visual, and so I didn't really think much about this until we started doing experiments looking at how elephants find food. At the end of this talk, I'll mention our work on conservation education, but this first study looking at whether or not elephants can follow human pointing cues to find food was designed in collaboration with the middle school students of the East Side Middle School, MS 114 in New York City, as part of a science curriculum we developed to bring elephants into classrooms virtually. Again, something we're going to try to replicate later tonight with all of you. Together with the students, we were interested in testing the so-called domestication hypothesis, which argues that domesticated animals like dogs, goats, and horses would be better at following human-provided social cues like pointing because we artificially selected or bred them for traits that would make these animals better at following our social behavior. Other species like chimpanzees, for instance, shouldn't be good at this because they don't typically rely on us for social information. But what about elephants? Elephants are unique because they are not domesticated. In other words, they have never been selectively bred by humans, but they have lived with humans for centuries. And here's a very important point that I want to stress because we're going to come to it in a bit. When I asked the mahouts before we started the experiment if the elephants followed cues like pointing, they said emphatically, yes. So here's what we do. We take 2 buckets, one with food, one without. The elephants love sunflower seeds, and for an animal that eats 250 kilos a day, that's more than 500 pounds of food a day, they never fill up on these sunflower seeds. We then point or use a hand gesture or an open hand to gesture towards one bucket, and we want to see if the elephants can find the food simply by following the point. We control for things like smell, and they never see us baiting the bucket. So the only way that they can find the food consistently is by following the point. So let's see if they do. No. And of more than a dozen elephants we've tested on this, none of them seem to be able to follow the point. But maybe there was something about this sliding table or the shade that made it more difficult for the elephants. So with a different group of elephants in Kanchanaburi, Thailand, and with a student, Oraya Kachairi, who was working with elephants in Kanchanaburi, we wanted to see whether or not elephants outside who had the opportunity to freely approach the buckets, whether or not they would follow the point. And again, no. So after I ran this study, the mahouts got really angry at me. They accused me of trying to make their elephants look stupid and that my experiments were flawed. So I asked them why they thought elephants follow pointing, and they told me that it was usually in the context of elephant tourism. Specifically, when elephants return to dry land after bathing with tourists in the river, the mahouts use the command pick up to ask the elephants to pick up the tourist sandals from the ground with their trunks, and then to hand these sandals back to the tourists who are usually riding on top of the elephants' necks. If any of you have ever seen the movie The Matrix, when Keanu Reeves' character at the end suddenly sees the world as if it were computer code, this was the first thought that shot through my mind as the mahouts were explaining this behavior to me. I thought, what if the world the elephant sees is not the world we see? What if the mahout, while pointing at the ground where the flip-flop sandals were, was not providing a visual cue that the elephant could follow, but an acoustic one? Elephants have big ears. They can localize sound really well, and maybe they were following the direction of the mahout's voice. What if when the elephant pointed their trunk in the direction of the mahout's voice, they smelled something unusual, and that unusual smell would be human feet? It wasn't the point the elephants were following, but perhaps it was something else. This led my team to start to ask questions of the elephants outside the visual domain. Using the same 2-bucket task, we now gave the elephants only sound information about the food's location. Due to the internet speeds that we all have in our homes, the sound may be slightly delayed, but hopefully it will be easy for you to find the food. And I'm going to play it without talking so you can follow.
Pepsi. Pepsi.
So I hope you knew where the food was, but the elephants did not. Why? Well, although elephants are known for their remarkable acoustic repertoires, they can communicate with family group members using a number of vocalizations over long distances. Would they really use the sound of food like fruits and vegetables in the wild to find them? But we needed to get past this step to move on to the most important one, which is testing olfaction, or the elephant's sense of smell. In this 2-bucket task, the elephants could not see or hear the food, but they could investigate the food by smelling for it. We lock the buckets at first so the elephant can smell them but not open them. We only open the buckets when it's time for the elephant to make a choice. Here, Pepsi very briefly uses his trunk to smell the 2 buckets while they are locked. And then later, when the buckets are unlocked, so here the buckets are locked and he's smelling on top of them. Later, when the buckets are unlocked, he chooses the bucket with the food. So he has a few seconds to investigate these buckets. You see how briefly he uses his trunk to smell the contents of the 2 buckets. We then unlock the lids and allow him to make a choice. And all of the elephants were very good at this. This helped me to realize that future experiments of elephant intelligence, especially those that use food as a reward, need to rely on the elephant's unique perspective of the world. So one more elephant experiment that illustrates some of our ideas moving forward, and that again, we need to remember that the animals whose minds we are studying may not see the world, and I put that in quotes, see the world as we do. Instead, they may hear, feel, or smell it. Which bucket do you think has more food? So you can talk amongst yourselves, but I'm pretty confident you can't tell, because if you look at these translucent buckets from the side, you really can't. But one actually has 150 sunflower seeds and the other has 180. We wanted to see if using smell alone, the elephants could tell the difference. Using a test setup very similar to the one you just saw, we allowed the elephant to smell 2 buckets with food and then choose one. Remarkably, although the elephants were better at differentiating quantities like 30 versus 180 sunflower seeds, in other words, they more consistently chose 180 versus 30 sunflower seeds simply by smelling the buckets, several of them were also exceptional, scoring above 80% on quantities like 150 versus 180 sunflower seeds. This, I think, is exceptional because it suggests that elephants may be making very careful decisions about where to go for food, perhaps from a distance. We hope to test this soon, simply by using their trunks to smell for the food. But before I jump into our work with wild elephants, I wanted to sidestep and briefly mention the fact that our work is not limited to just elephants. A master's student in the ABC program at Hunter College, Joshua DePaula, and I had the unique opportunity to work with pangolins, an animal most people have never heard of. Unfortunately, not only do we know practically nothing about pangolins, the only scaly mammal, they are also the most heavily trafficked animal on the planet. They are poached for their scales primarily for traditional medicinal practices. Pangolins can be very difficult to locate in the wild, and so by better understanding how pangolins find food, for instance, we hope conservation strategies focus on protecting not only the pangolins themselves, but their food and habitat as well. Here's a night vision video of one of the pangolins, Josh nicknamed him Pluto, locating food in a container using only his snout. This study was done at a rural Mahidol University Wildlife Hospital in central Thailand, with pangolins that were at the hospital to be rehabilitated, under the direction of Dr. Manot Yindi, the hospital director. You will hear a loud motorbike in the background, and then Pluto's nose going off as he approaches the container of ants. If you listen carefully, you can hear his nose. this study, we found similar results to the elephants. Pangolins are olfactory animals, and it seems that they use the smell of their prey to find it. But in case you didn't hear his nose there, one way of studying the animal's perspective in our experiments is by trying to take that perspective ourselves. And so here, in this fun video we made using a GoPro camera, we see and hear that Pluto uses his tongue and his snout to track live ants we've given him as a treat. So the sound of Pluto's nose going off as he smells and tastes the live ant should be pretty obvious. I've often wondered how work on animal behavior and cognition can be applied to conservation, and other scientists have begun to try and find ways to incorporate behavior research into conservation strategy development. I think we have an exciting opportunity to do this for animals like pangolins and elephants as well. Here, I'll illustrate briefly how over the past several years, my team has developed an approach to studying elephants in the wild that we hope will be particularly impactful in terms of human-elephant conflict mitigation. But of course, you might be asking, what is human-elephant conflict? Human-elephant conflict occurs in both Africa and Asia and is the result of increasing human encroachment on wild habitat, as well as habitat loss. Elephants leave protected areas or national parks and regularly come into contact with farmers, local villagers, or their crops and food stores. This results in physical confrontations that sometimes lead to both human and elephant deaths. Typically, we try to prevent this conflict by moving problem elephants away or using physical barriers like electric fences or trenches, or digging trenches, setting off firecrackers, or shooting off guns. Here you can see some of these mitigation strategies in action. On the top left is an electric fence that villagers have set up that the elephant is now approaching. On the top right are homemade firecrackers that the farmers may set off to scare the elephants away. On the bottom left are trenches that the local villagers have dug in order to prevent the elephants from crossing into their crop fields. And on the right is a warning system that will alert the farmers to the elephant's presence when the elephants approach. But the problem is that these solutions or strategies rarely work long-term. Elephants are smart. They habituate and they learn to avoid or confront humans in order to get the resources they're after. Most of these strategies rely on what we call fear conditioning. In other words, if we scare an elephant away from our crop fields, they won't want to come back. For those of you who have or have worked with children, know this doesn't work. Tell a child that they can't have a cookie in a cookie jar by putting up a gate in your kitchen, and invariably you'll find an empty cookie jar later on in the day. The same goes for elephants. So we hypothesized that a better understanding of elephant behavior, in other words, why elephants do what they do and what the elephant's ecological and behavioral needs are, could lead to longer lasting human-elephant conflict mitigation because they account for both parties in the conflict. And that means that we're accounting for both the elephants and the humans' needs in the conflict. To think of it another way, if we understood that elephants are great social learners, for instance, that they learn really well by watching each other, we'd know that when you move a problem elephant, one that knows how to deactivate an electric fence, for instance, to an area with no problem elephants, you may have just created a whole new population of problem elephants where they didn't previously exist. If we understood that some elephants could innovate in problem solving, we might not invest so much in expensive yet vulnerable electric fences because the elephants can quickly learn how to get around them. If we understood that the elephants are after high quality, high caloric food in the crop fields, we might try to rethink our use of loud noises that elephants learn quickly are of no real consequence. So here's our field site. Our field site is the Sulak Pra Wildlife Sanctuary in Kanchanaburi, Thailand. So I'd say west central Thailand on the Myanmar border. You can see it filled in the dark red on the map on the left here with the pointer. The red border outline represents the province of Kanchanaburi. The sanctuary is a protected area that, as you can see on the right, is surrounded by human habitation. The triangles represent villages that are either on the border of the protected area or in some cases, you can see down here, completely inside it. There are an estimated 300 elephants in this landscape, many of which we think are in conflict with the local people. Our project, with support from Hunter College, the Research Foundation of the City University of New York, and several other outside funders, and in collaboration with several Thai entities, including Mahidol University and the Thai Department of National Parks, aims to do a number of things here. First, we want to ID or identify as many elephants as we can. You can't study individual personality without these data. And Sasha Montero, a master's student in my lab, has already identified more than 80 individuals in this landscape. Second, we have built watchtowers and installed remote sensing video camera traps, I'll show you these in a moment, in both the protected area, so in other words, inside the national park, and within crop fields inside the villages outside the protected area, both to observe elephant behavior directly. Do elephants interact with each other differently when they are safely drinking from a water hole inside the protected area than perhaps when they're eating sugarcane surrounded by angry farmers? Do they raid crops as family groups, or do they go at it alone? Third, can we look at personality by installing cognition puzzle boxes for wild elephants to investigate? These are questions we are addressing now. Later, we hope to look at whether or not we can identify particular personality traits that may predict crop raiding tendencies. In other words, does personality help predict whether or not elephants are more or less likely to take risks? And if it does, can we help the elephants make different choices? This, of course, is not going to be easy, nor do we have an answer to this last question about helping elephants make different choices. But we believe that long-term solutions to human-elephant conflict can't simply rely on keeping humans and elephants apart. They must account for the elephant's ecological needs and intelligence as well. So since January 2019, our full-time Thai team and our Hunter College and Graduate Center students have been collecting data from watchtowers, as you can see Dr. Wow doing here from one of our bamboo watchtowers inside a protected area, and from 40 remote sensing video cameras that you can see here on the right. While we're also camping in bamboo trees and learning from local villagers and rangers about the conflict. Although this might not be everyone's idea of fun with no air conditioning during 100+ degree weather, and Kanchanaburi happens to be the hottest province in Thailand, my team and my colleagues, we love it. Although we are just starting to analyze our data, we are excited by what we are seeing. So here is a video montage of the elephant families we've seen around watering holes inside the protected areas with our camera traps. Look for the sibling rivalry in a second that I'm sure all of you with brothers and sisters have experienced as well. Hopefully you don't often kick your brothers and sisters, but this is a friendly reminder that the elephant is coming too close. And here you can see a large family group of elephants, or potentially several family groups, bathing peacefully in a protected watering hole inside the protected area of Salak Pra Wildlife Sanctuary. You can see that in a safe area like a watering hole, the elephants have the opportunity to be just elephants. I figured I'd stop talking for a moment and let you listen and watch the peaceful elephants here. Our cameras around the crop fields, on the other hand, illustrate how innovative and how great at problem solving the elephants may be. So here is a bull elephant leaving the protected area and immediately testing an amateur electric fence. He touches it with the front of his trunk, apparently briefly being shocked by it, before using his foot pad to snap the electric fence wire. He then walks directly into the farmer's sugarcane field. Although this electric fence is homemade, and it's not like an expensive permanent one, the potential for conflict between elephants and humans in this landscape should be clear. Going back to a question I mentioned earlier that we're interested in, you may be thinking that elephants must obviously behave differently in risky situations, like going into crop fields, versus safer situations like drinking water at a protected watering hole. But that may not always be the case. Here's infrared camera video we shot inside a sugarcane field. The pink light is from our infrared camera because we do our best to avoid influencing the elephant's behavior, while allowing the farmers to interact with the elephants as they normally would. The white light is from the farmer's pickup truck. You can see how relaxed the elephant is here. This is a bull. His tail is straight and relaxed. His ears are resting back rather than fully forward, which would be a sign of apprehension or alertness. You can also see that he seems to be eating the sugarcane without a care in the world. This is actually scary because it means that he may have no incentive to avoid continuing this behavior. You can imagine how this conflict might soon escalate from simply shining flashlights to potentially something more aggressive. Our hope is that a better understanding of the elephants and their behavior could help prevent this. In addition to our direct observations of wild elephant behavior, we are also trialing our wild elephant cognition experiments in a number of places. Satish Venkatesh, a master's student at Hunter College, working with me and our collaborators at the Smithsonian, have begun to look at how personality differences in what we call semi-wild elephants in Myanmar, and this means that they work in logging during the day, but are released to forests close to human habitat at night, may help us better understand why some elephants crop raid and others do not. Similarly, Sarah Jacobson, a PhD student in my lab who will shortly be taking care of the Q&A, and I have just started our wild elephant cognition research in Thailand, and our results are very promising. Sarah designed a puzzle box with 3 different compartments, each with a different solution. You could push a door open to get food, you could pull a chain to get access to a compartment, or you could slide a door to get access to food. And this allows us to look at a number of personality traits that we suspect differ between elephants and between populations. Amanda Puetzia, a master's student, Sarah and I first piloted the box in collaboration with colleagues at both the Oklahoma City Zoo and the Rosamond Gifford Zoo in Syracuse. And now, just a few months ago, we begun to test the wild elephant's interest in the puzzle box. Although many elephants approach the box apprehensively, or in many cases not at all, there are those like this wild bull that not only approach it, but solve it. He solves the first solution, pulling the chain to get access to the jackfruit inside very quickly, which may suggest he had worked on it on previous days. We're still reviewing the tapes to see, but again, I have to reiterate, this is a wild elephant and not an elephant with any experience having worked alongside people. We're excited by this because honestly, we were not sure whether the elephants would want to approach a novel object like this at all, let alone try to solve it. We suspect again that these individual differences in behavior or personality could help us better understand why some elephants crop raid and others do not. The video is quite long, so for time's sake, I'm just showing the elephant solving the pull and the slide. He solves push, the top compartment, just a minute or so later. My team and I are excited for the future of elephant behavior research. We plan to continue our research in collaboration with US zoos and our colleagues in Asia. We are interested in understanding how cognition differs across species, but also how it differs within species, and that means personality and individual differences. We are excited to continue to try to understand the animal's perspective when designing experiments, especially those animals that see, and I put that in quotes again, the world much differently than we do. Finally, we hope our work can help protect endangered species by ensuring animal behavior becomes an important part of conservation strategies moving forward. Before I move on to my final slides about conservation education, I wanted to add a point about the current crisis we are facing. Regardless of the coronavirus's origin, it is clear that our continued and increasing contact with wildlife not only threatens their existence, but also our own. It is crucially important that we recognize the importance of biodiversity. In other words, the great variety of animal and plant life on our planet, both in supporting the health of our planet's ecosystems, but also in potentially supporting our own health as well. I have always felt that the most important thing we can do as science educators is to enable the next generations of scientists to think critically about the world around them. And so to that end, my colleagues and I have tried to use elephants as a conduit for teaching young people about science inside and outside the classroom. When I first started publishing my dissertation work, I was surprised by the emails I received from young children telling me how fascinated they were by elephants and asking how they could help them. I reached out to a longtime friend of mine, David Getz, a children's book author and the principal of MS 114 of 114 Eastside Middle School in New York, who invited me to teach his students about our work. With my graduate school classmate, Dr. Jen Pokorny, we have since designed education programs as part of a small nonprofit we started, Think Elephants International, before I came to Hunter, that has allowed us to work to bring animal behavior and cognition research into classrooms around the world, including in collaboration with the Thai government. I'm excited about the possibility of not only continuing to study the efficacy of our conservation education programming, but also collaborating with Hunter College and other CUNY students and faculty on this research and outreach. We are collecting and just now starting to analyze data, looking at what students learn in our program and how their values about elephants and the environment might change over time. And here you see survey questions in both English for our students in the US and Thai for our students in Thailand. The students go through a multi-week program centered on engaging them in learning about animal behavior, conservation, and research design, to name some of the topics. And we collect survey data to try to understand what they know about elephants and, more importantly, whether they value them. This is especially important for our work in Thailand, where elephants live. But whether it is literally bringing the elephants to students in Thailand or working with young people whose entire family centers around elephant care, or in the case of New York, bringing the elephants to students virtually, we think we have an opportunity to engage young people for a passion in science, both inside and outside the classroom. Elephants, acting as a conduit, can encourage students to ask questions about and develop an interest in the environment. It doesn't take much to trigger a passion in a child, and elephants are an easy motivator. After talking about elephants, people often ask me what I can do to help. How can I get involved? And this is the way I like to end some of my talks. One is to, of course, support institutions like Hunter College and those that encourage scientific inquiry and science education. When children ask, I often tell them about a game. It's simple, but it's effective. We call it the Saving Space game. It's similar to musical chairs in that the kids move around a single sheet of newspaper until the music stops, and then they all have to jump on top of it. Beforehand, the students are told half of them are people and half of them are elephants. Every iteration of the game results in the paper being folded in half until the students are laughing as they push each other off the paper. This video was taken during one of our programs in Chiang Rai, Thailand, on the Thai border with Myanmar and Laos. The students get it. Time is running out, and so is enough space to support the coexistence of people and wildlife like elephants. I'm confident that with the kids' help, it's not too late. Thank you very much to our wonderful Hunter College and Graduate Center students for their hard work, and to the rangers and Thai government officials and my colleagues in Thailand who have supported us. I couldn't do any of this research without them, my faculty colleagues at CUNY and elsewhere for their advice and support, and I thank our funders. Please feel free to reach out if your questions are not answered tonight or if you come up with some later. And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing the slide. So if you wanna grab my email address or our Twitter handle or our website, please quickly grab your phones to take a snapshot. The email is pretty straightforward, joshelephant@gmail.com. But with that, I wanna first introduce Sarah Jacobson, who will be taking care of the Q&A. And as well, my friend and colleague, John Roberts, who's stationed with the elephants in Thailand.
Hello.
Hey, Sarah. So Sarah Jacobson is a second-year PhD student at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, who's been working in my lab and has been spearheading the wild elephant research that we are doing in Thailand. And you cannot see John, but I'm gonna, would the team mind unmuting John? There we go. John, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Good morning from Thailand. Good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Welcome to the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation here in far north Thailand with Plum and Jatong, two of our elephants, one of which I think you've worked with, Josh. Plum, for sure. I know that. She's been in all your videos. We're here on far north Thailand, so across on that bank is Myanmar. The river is actually the Ruak River, and it is international waters, but the elephants don't know that. Possibly a good topic for your talk, and elephants not really understanding human boundaries. But luckily, they know what they're doing. They're having a nice bath here in the Golden Triangle.
John, would you mind just telling us a little bit about the foundation and your work there?
Okay, so we set up the foundation in 2005 primarily to bring elephants off the streets of Bangkok. In those days, captive elephants were begging on the streets of Bangkok with their mahouts because there was no other income for them. As you pointed out, they have to eat about 250 kilograms of food a day, which is why they raid farmers' crops when they're in the wild. And actually, Plum was the first elephant that came off the streets, the elephant on the left-hand side of the screen here. So we're up here looking after 21 elephants on site. Once tourism kicked in and started to feed a lot of the elephants in Thailand, and there are about 3,700 elephants in captivity in Thailand, the problem with elephants begging on the streets disappeared. And so we branched out, as you know, Josh, but as people don't know, to try and help fund bigger picture projects with our foundation. So we train mahouts in better ways of looking after elephants, and in the hope that they can come up with a hybrid between their traditional ways and modern non-punishment-free ways of handling elephants, and also invest in scientific projects such as your own and a few others. So the idea is to try and, our goals are very much aligned with yours, which is why we've been working together for over 10 years now, to try and learn more about elephants, not only, as you say, to look after them better to protect them better in the wild, but also to look after them better look after them better in captivity as well, because they're the same animal, and they have the same needs. So let's learn how we can better fulfill those needs while we have them in captivity. Of course, we prefer they were all wild, but as I say, there are 3,000 in private ownership, 3,700 mostly in private ownership in Thailand alone, and they're not going to be wild anytime soon, or at all, the majority of them. So we're here to look after elephants and learn more about them.
Thank you, John. And the work you're doing is fantastic. And I can say that not only because I spent much of the last decade working with you, but also because you've been very supportive of the work that we've been doing. Sarah, do you want to start with some questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll start off with some of the questions that you were getting about human-elephant conflict. And one question that came up from Jody was, how dangerous are the techniques used by humans in human-elephant conflict?
Thank you, Jody, for that great question. It depends from region to region. So for instance, there are some locations like our field sites in Thailand where I don't think most of the strategies are dangerous. So for instance, shooting firecrackers above the elephant's head, we've noticed that the elephants have habituated to that very quickly, and they don't seem to even mind it. What they tend to do is to pin their ears back against their head, which we suspect allows them to kind of let the sound wash over them rather than them gathering it with those big ears. And they seem to wait until the threat passes. Electric fences are meant to provide a very low voltage shock. But unfortunately, sometimes when farmers erect amateur or kind of low grade electric fences, sometimes that they can malfunction and result in the elephants being killed. In some other countries like India, for instance, where some of the human-elephant conflict is of a very high intensity, unfortunately, sometimes humans and elephants are killed. So we want to work very hard to try to prevent this from escalating. And one way we think we can do that is by trying to better understand their behavior.
So another question that was asked was about using other animals to keep elephants out of such crops. This was from Vasilis, and they mentioned the beehives as one option, as well as even an example of pigs used with Alexander the Great and war elephants, which I had not heard of, but that's a very interesting example.
I didn't know that either. Thank you, Vasilis, for that great question. And it's great to learn from the audience as well. Not me personally considering this, and actually I may throw this question to John as well. But typically, in some locations, mahouts will use captive elephants to try to patrol wild habitat to keep wild elephants away. And so sometimes this can work. And as you mentioned, and I see some other questions have asked this as well, a mitigation strategy I did not talk about was the use of honeybee fences, which is shown to be extremely effective in Africa. And what this means is basically you set up honeybee hives along the periphery of a crop field, and the African honeybee is highly aggressive. So the elephants learn very quickly that this is a bee that if they get too close to will sting them, it will hurt, and the elephants seem to be avoiding these crop fields. In addition, it provides a great cash crop for the farmers, so it's a win-win. The problem is, although some people are starting to study this in Asia, the Asian honeybee is not nearly as aggressive. And so we are not optimistic about it being as effective here in Asia, in countries like Thailand.
Great. Another important question I think that was asked by a couple people about the interdisciplinary work between elephant decisions and human decisions. And so the sort of, your work either with farmers as well and the Thai government. And those questions were both asked by Don and
Don, thank you very much for those great questions. It's difficult. I think navigating any environment and working in a country that is not our own makes it difficult to kind of try and figure out ways to complement our research on elephant behavior with the needs of local people. And so a big part of what we do is to spend a lot of time in the villages, working closely with the villagers, sleeping alongside them in watchtowers and getting to know what their needs are. Right? So from the perspective of a comparative psychologist, I would say, well, I'm really interested in understanding why the elephants are doing this and how do we help the elephants? How do we fulfill the elephants' needs for food, the elephants' needs for habitat? But it's difficult to then take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, there are people involved in this conflict as well. And some of the nicest people we've ever met. And so these are people who don't have any choice but to spend most of their nights sleeping in the watchtowers trying to scare the elephants away. Something really remarkable that we learned really early on was that most of the farmers we work with don't blame the elephants for what's going on. They recognize that this is an unwinnable situation, or at least they think it's an unwinnable situation. And they plead with the governments to try to find a way to provide suitable habitat, both for the elephants and for the people to provide for their families. So it's a very difficult thing to try to reconcile, but we're working hard to do that.
And another question about this human-elephant conflict mitigation was asked by Rachel, asking, since the team seems to be interested in identifying olfactory, auditory as primary mode of communication, thinking with elephants, has any exploratory attempt been made to use natural scents to deter elephants from crops, such as marigolds planted along crops to naturally deter insects? Is there, for example, a scent elephants encounter in the wild that leads to danger or a sound?
That's also an excellent question. You guys are asking fantastic questions, and some of which we've thought of and some of which we have not. I think actually, the one that comes to mind right away is the use of chili fences. So putting up a very strong aversive smell and or taste like a chili along a fence that borders your crop field is a really good way of deterring elephants. And it happens to be one that has been really effective. I would also argue that probably the honey from honeybee fences, once the elephants learn to associate the pain of getting stung by a bee with the smell of the honey, would also be aversive. Sarah, John, do you have any thoughts on other scents that may have already been used to deter elephants?
Not that I can think of. I think it's very much in its infancy. My only worry is with the scent is that it may become aversive if the honey smell may become aversive if the bees do sting them. The problem, as you mentioned earlier, is the Asian honeybees who can work with humans either don't sting them or they're so aggressive they kill humans as well. So that becomes a problem. They certainly are worried about certain bee species and hornet species, but not the ones that humans can live with. Other smells, no, I don't think they work for long. That's the problem. You would think, as I say, as your crop grading video earlier showed, the things that are aversive to start with, certainly flashlights and human contact is aversive to start with, and there would be smells affected associated with that. But as soon as they work out that it's not problematic or doesn't harm them in the long term, then they find a way around it. Similarly, I think with chili fences, I do actually know elephants who eat chili. Mind you, they're Thai elephants.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think auditory wise, there's been a little bit of work with the Asian elephants and some sounds of growls by cats, but not the smells, at least in Asia.
Yes, and the sound of bees as well, they've tried.
The sound of bees, yes, right. And I know John and his colleagues are working on that as well. I just wanted to kind of interject here, and unfortunately we couldn't do it while it was happening, but some of you that were watching the elephants rather than looking at us, which I hope you're doing, you might have seen the elephant on the right. She actually turned, put her ears fully out, and put her trunk in what we might call a periscope raise. So this was an elephant that heard or smelled something and was immediately alert to it. And that's representative of the type of behaviors that our research team is looking at when we're trying to see whether or not elephants react differently when they're in a safe, non-risky situation like around a watering hole versus when they might be around a riskier situation like within a crop field.
Yeah, spot on, Josh. And downriver, there are some fishermen who've just turned up, and these are international waters. And so that's exactly what she was checking out.
Well, I'm going to go back to one of the earliest questions that we got, asking a little bit about elephant emotions from Miriam in New York, asking if elephants cry.
I love this. Thank you, Miriam, for this question. I love this question, but I actually am going to turn it over to John because John answers this question so often that I suspect he'll have the better answer.
They don't have the apparatus to be able to cry emotionally. They also don't have the apparatus to be able to drain their eye. We as humans have something apparently on the inside of our eyelid that drains our tears. The tears that we use to lubricate our eye on a day-to-day basis drains that down back to our throat. Elephants don't have that. So very often, of course, if you can see the environment they live in here, sometimes it's drier and dustier, or they're going into the mud and everything else. So they need to be able to lubricate their eye to keep their eye functioning, and that water just runs down their face. Excessive tearing can be a sign of an eye infection, and the vets, Dr. Nisa, our vet, uses it to know that when elephants need their eyes treated, or maybe they're being kept in places that don't let them wander around quite as much as we do, they're being kept in too much sunlight or outside shade or anything like that on short chains, which unfortunately happens. But actually, crying due to emotion is not something that they are equipped to do, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, I guess. But, well, no, unfortunately, we'd be able to tell more about their emotions if we could read them that easily.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, John.
And a somewhat related question by Mary, do elephants remember and hold grudges? What evidence do we have?
So that's a great question as well, Mary. And, you know, the saying that elephants never forget is one that I think is tied largely to historical myths and you know, stories that have been passed down. But there is a lot of evidence that elephants have remarkable memories when it comes to remembering family members that they may not have come into contact with over long periods of time. Yep. So elephants quite often split from their big herds into smaller family groups when they're migrating across the savanna in Africa, for instance, and they may come back together regularly or infrequently, and they seem to have quite a strong memory for those interactions. When it comes to holding a grudge, now whether or not that exists in the wild, I don't think we have any evidence for that, but there are anecdotes, and I've seen it personally, and I'm sure John can attest to this as well, that elephants that work very closely with their mahouts, and mahouts again are the caretakers, and in Thailand and India and Sri Lanka and Myanmar, these are countries where the mahouts in many cases very long-term relationships with the elephants, and some of those relationships are positive and some of them are negative, and anecdotally I have seen elephants react negatively or to retaliate against mahouts that have not treated them well. John, would you agree with that?
Yes, and such things as, and again, anecdotally, if an elephant has been abused by, or we guess has been abused by an alcoholic mahout, there are elephants who will not tolerate anyone who smells of whiskey. So they seem to hold grudges against people who smell of whiskey or perhaps cigarettes or something along those lines. And yes, anecdotally against people as well, for reasons sometimes unknown, but certainly there are elephants who they are complex characters, and there are elephants that don't like certain people for some reason. Even if they've been nothing but nice to them, as I try my best to be, there are elephants who don't like me.
Thanks,
The
John.
smell of me.
Um,
Smell of whiskey.
Sarah, can I turn a question to you? Actually, I see one in the chat that I think you'd be great to answer from Diane Somberger. Diane, thank you for the question. She writes, in the puzzle box, was it novel to the elephants? In other words, was the puzzle box not presented open with food inside first? And do jackfruit have a strong smell? Just wondering how they knew food was inside.
Yeah, so jackfruit have a very strong smell. They're very sweet fruit, and we actually decided to use that as a reward in our study because we had heard that some elephants had actually broken into some of the rangers' refrigerators to get jackfruit out of it. So it was something they could smell, you know, even inside a fridge at a ranger station. So yes, they're very attracted to smelling this from inside the box. So it is a novel apparatus to them in that they've never seen a box like that. And we did not present it without food first, but there's a couple different ways you can look at sort of an animal's response to novelty, and we were looking at, you know, when food was present, how they would interact with it, at least initially. We may look at some other completely novel objects without food in the reactions as well in the future.
Something really, thank you, Sarah. Something that's interesting that Sarah's alluding to also is that, you know, we never know what's going to happen when we put something up in the wild. And so we're concerned that, you know, we got to get it right the first time because we don't know when an elephant's going to come or whether they're going to come back again at all.
Yeah, that actually relates to a question that I had seen also from Richard about asking how we get enough observations for statistical validity. And that can be difficult, but we are just hoping that you know, the elephants are interested in this and come back enough that we can get some repeat visitors and it will be up long enough that we have enough interactions with it.
Our study site, Cella Pra, is quite large, and we only installed approximately 40 remote sensing video camera traps. And I will say honestly that we were initially quite pessimistic about how much data we would collect. But Sarah, you'll have to update me on the total, but I think in terms of number of total clips we've collected over the past year plus, we're looking at upwards of 50 to 70,000 clips at this point of elephant behavior. So I am now optimistic that we will have plenty of data to go through, and we have a number of students in the lab now. I mentioned some, there are many others. You can check out our website to see what those students are doing. And these students are working hard, even from home, and I am, greatly appreciate the work that they're doing from home to go through all of this stuff.
Yeah, it's many clips to watch. A few people have asked questions related to African elephants. One in particular that I thought you would be interested in talking about is asking about whether similar work has been conducted with African elephants as far as cognitive or perceptive abilities, and would you expect to see differences in the behavior like cooperation or cognition due to novel problems they encounter in their environment? That was from Alyssa.
Thank you. Yeah, that's also a great question. You know, I chose Asian elephants to start to work with as a graduate student because I was able to go before I started my research and saw the relationship between the mahouts and the elephants. And that got me thinking that it would be really great and potentially easy. And it was never easy, I must say, but at least it was conducive to setting up controlled experiments when I knew that the elephants could be safely and humanely controlled for these experiments. In Africa, that's not usually the case. African elephants are almost exclusively wild, although we are seeing an increasing number of wild elephants coming into captivity at certain safari centers. But there are a few researchers like Melissa Schmidt, Lucy Bates, Hannah Mumby, others that are studying elephant cognition in Africa. And so I'm excited to see what those results are. And we are starting to work with some of those researchers as collaborators to try to look at differences between the species. Do I suspect there will be differences? Yes. And in fact, something I didn't mention was that with the pointing study, although the Asian elephants didn't do well, African elephants do follow pointing cues. And why that is, well, it could be something to do with our methodology, how we designed our experiments, something as simple as that. But one thought that I have is that from the elephant's ecological wild perspective, Asian elephants live in really dense forests where vision is probably not as important as vision might be to an African elephant living on the open savanna. Now, that's just a hypothesis. We haven't tested it yet. But it certainly supports what you're suggesting, that potentially there are differences between these elephant species. And I'll say that Asian and African elephants diverged more than 6 million years ago. So there was plenty of time for the evolution of different behaviors between these animals.
And another question somewhat related to that, Linda asked about knowing that African elephants have been seen grieving near bones of elephants. Has this been seen with Asian elephants as well? Are there examples?
Also, yeah, great question. Thank you. John, I actually want to throw that to John because I don't know of any off the top of my head. John, did you hear that question?
I did, yes. Not that I know of, and that's possibly, again, because one of the reasons we don't know so much about Asian elephants and their cognition and everything else in the wild is, as you said, they're very, very difficult to watch for long times, whereas the anecdotes of elephants visiting the bones come from Samburu and Amboseli, and places where you can spend all day watching the same herd of elephants, or you can find an elephant skeleton. Yes, I don't know. In captivity, unfortunately, we have had elephants who have died here on site of old age and things like that. And I have been always somewhat surprised, given the anecdotes, how calmly and how little interest their elephants' friends, that we tend to think of them as friends because they hang out together, how calmly they reacted to the dead elephant. But that could be something conflated by captivity, and not necessarily because of the facing the same worries in the wild.
Thank you. Sarah, if you don't mind, I'm looking at questions too, and I just saw two from Dr. Chachot Titaram, who's one of Thailand's top elephant veterinarians. So it's great that he was able to join. And he asked a question about how you select elephants that can join the work. And are there any effects of some elephants being wiser than others? So I would say that practically speaking, sometimes it comes down to where we are able to get our data. So with the wild elephants, we don't select them. The wild elephants have an opportunity to approach Bill. With the captive elephants, it has a lot to do with our conversations with mahouts. So although I feel like after 13 years of working with elephants, I know them pretty well, I would argue that mahouts are an incredible wealth of information when it comes to their elephants, especially their own. And so asking them about how they think they'll do on an experiment, or asking them whether or not they are an aggressive elephant that might potentially cause trouble during the experiment. You saw me talk about Pepsi, an elephant that used to live at the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation. Pepsi was a star research subject of mine. He was an incredibly intelligent elephant. He's still alive, so I'm talking about him in the past tense, but it's just we aren't working with him right now. And he was incredibly docile and worked really well with us. And I think that was largely due to the fact that he had a great mahout. Dr. Chachot also asked, can personality tests possibly help you identify elephants who may attack or be harmful to people? I don't know about that, because I think we want to be careful about, and I thank you for that question, because it reminds me that I want to say that we want to be careful that we're not trying to be the elephant psychologists. We're not trying to say, is this an elephant that needs therapy? Right? I mean, I think that becomes very anthropomorphic. That's not our goal here. What we're trying to see is whether or not there are certain personality traits, things like that can be measured, like things like neophobia, neophilia, which is being afraid of a novel object, right? Innovation, are elephants very good problem solvers? These are personality traits that may help us better understand why some elephants are crop raiding and some are not. Now, we don't want to target crop raiding elephants for any sort of violent negative mitigation strategy, but what we're saying is that instead of trying to keep 300 elephants out of a crop field, maybe we can identify a select few and target our mitigation, our peaceful, I would say, positive mitigation strategies towards those elephants, saving not only money, but also time.
Yeah. There were a few questions that came in about the elephants we're actually seeing on screen. If John can answer a couple of those. Ellie asked, what is the relationship, if we know it, between the two that we're watching, because they seem quite affiliative?
We don't know, unfortunately, because they came to us at separate times. Blurm, who's the elephant that's currently lying down, came 15 years ago, and Jatong on the left came only about 5 or 6 years ago, but we can guess that they have no relationship. Jatong was a northern elephant. She was working in, before she came to us, she was working in Myanmar, moving logs around, whereas Blurm we found on the streets of Bangkok. But what we do here, as I say, we have 21 elephants on site. We, again, after talking to Mahoots, we tentatively put elephants together in groups of 3 or 4, and try and build what we call friendship groups. Again, it's whether they're friends or not is difficult to tell, but that are that can be together. There's usually one decision maker, but that can assert her decisions without using violence or physical pressure on other elephants, which sometimes happens, especially when it happens in the wild when elephants have known each other forever. You saw that kick in the video earlier. But happens even more so in captivity when if you were to throw a bunch of 21 elephants together, you would have some elephants that would bully the others and some elephants that would be cowed. So what we try and do is build friendship groups of 3 or 4 elephants that can hang out together like this. There was another one called Bo around here earlier, and she's usually the decision maker, and she made the decision to go somewhere else. So these 3 hang out together. Blurm, who's lying down, is actually a great an elephant that can be almost with any group. She doesn't have any preferences. She can hang out with any elephant, but these 2 are especially fun together, and they love the water, and love, I mean, Blurm almost goes to sleep. So they're, I mean, as far as you can say, they're friends that have been hanging out together for 5 years or so, and we try and make sure that they're together as much as possible. Although, as I say, Blurm goes off and joins other groups from time to time also. And certainly affiliative, yes.
Yeah, related to the behavior we're seeing now, Ella also had a question about whether this play or relaxation that we're seeing occurs more in water, and then also if you can talk a little bit about elephant play, maybe some response from John and from Josh there.
Okay, yes, this does. It seems it's in water. They suddenly seem to become more playful because neither of these are baby elephants. They're both in their late 20s, or Blurm's late 20s. Jatong is mid 30s, I think. But when they come to water, they seem to play more like young elephants. Now, whether that's because they didn't get a chance to play when they were younger, as you see in Josh's videos in the wild, the babies are playing all the time in the water and behaving just like this, or babies, young elephants, calves, whatever we call them scientifically. I tend to get anthropomorphic, I'm afraid. And they play just like this in the water. And whether one of the negative consequences of captivity is they don't get to do that quite so often when they're growing up with humans, I don't know. But as soon as they're in water, they tend to play like this. Interestingly, with these 2, Blurm is usually the decision maker and the one who's leading the way, whereas as soon as they get in the water, Jatong is the one who starts to make the decisions and to climb on and try and assert herself as the boss. She'll climb on top of the elephants as well. I'll let Josh answer for the play behavior, apart from to say that, as with any animal, I think it's important that especially as young animals, they play to learn their boundaries, learn their hierarchy, but also learn skills that will help them be adult elephants in the wild.
Yeah, and I think actually, we don't actually know that much, at least from a scientific perspective, about elephant play, especially in Asian elephants. It's actually something that we're thinking about looking at with our colleagues at Hunter College, because I don't think it's been kind of a primary focus with elephants. There are plenty of studies on non-human primate, particularly chimpanzee and bonobo play. And so please look those up if you're interested. Some really interesting work about how that in some ways mimics our own play behavior. But as John said, you can see baby elephants, how when they learn to use their trunk, that they're quite often doing repetitive play-like movements with their trunks. behavior like this that we're seeing right here in the water, I don't know how you could describe this as anything but play behavior. But that's anecdotal. You know, I think we would have to kind of look deeper into when elephants do behaviors like this, and whether they're unique to positive social interactions like this, which I suspect that they are. I mean, I would certainly argue that Bloom's behavior right now is clearly one of play.
Yes.
We had a question from a little while ago about age or sex difference in elephant performance on cognitive tasks, whether you've seen any from Shelley.
Thank you, Shelley. That's also a great question. You know, I can only kind of comment on that anecdotally. And the reason for that is in our cognitive experiments, we've never had a large enough sample size to look at differences in things like sex, males versus females, or even age, which is something we'd be really interested in, looking at developmental differences in cognitive abilities across elephants. That's actually something that I'm talking to colleagues about doing, but it would require access to a lot of elephants. And most zoos in the US or even elephant camps in Thailand, you don't have that level of access. So we've traditionally looked at questions about whether or not a particular species, in this case elephants, have the capacity to do something. In other words, if we give the elephants a particular task and a couple of them solve it, that says to us that this species has the capacity to do it. But I agree that it would be really interesting to take that a step further and look at whether or not there are individual differences in the expression of those behaviors within a species. In other words, if we look at 100 or 200 elephants, would we see that females were better than males at a memory task versus a cooperation task? You know, and I could think of a lot of hypotheses, for instance, why females may be better at cooperative tasks than males. And one thought on that would be that males leave the matriarchal herd once they reach sexual maturity, and they either go off on their own as bachelors or they form bachelor herds with other males. So it's possible that cooperation may not be as important to them. Anecdotally, the males that we worked with have done better on some of the food or foraging related tasks that we've done, specifically the smell tests and the quantity test. And that may be simply because they're bigger and because they need more nutrients and need to eat more during the day. They may be more tuned into the fact that I'm presenting them with different quantities of food. That's just a thought, and we have to really kind of think about how to test that further.
But for the crop rating, Josh, are you seeing more males or females going out?
From a personal, we actually haven't gone through the data well enough to know that yet, but based on what everyone has told us, including the farmers and our colleagues, both in Thailand and outside, it does tend to be overwhelmingly males. But very interestingly, Sarah and I have looked at videos and seen small, what may be family groups or young calves with females. We're not sure yet. So there may be variability in that, and that will be really kind of telling in terms of what makes a crop rating elephant a crop rating elephant. But the videos that I showed you of crop rating today in this talk were all of lone bachelor males.
Right.
We also had a question from Jody about, is there a source for information for elementary teachers to use to educate in this discipline?
Fantastic question, thank you. Please feel free to drop me an email. I think that's the best way to point you in that direction. So again, that's joshelephant, one word, @gmail.com. And I would be happy to point you in the direction of some of those resources and also put you in touch with Dr. Pokorny, who's been leading our education programs. These are programs that I hope to continue both in the US and in Thailand with, I'm excited to collaborate with Hunter College colleagues on this.
We also had a question about sort of the relationship between elephants and mahouts. From Pakanut, how do elephants think about their mahouts as friends, family members, leaders, etc.?
Sarah, let's skip a little bit. Would you mind asking that question one more time?
Yeah, sure. The question was about elephants and their mahouts. How do elephants think about their mahouts as friends, family members, leaders, etc.? And what do we know?
Thank you. That's a great question from Thailand, I know. we try to be careful about being anthropomorphic. In other words, trying to project our own thoughts and emotions onto animals like elephants. They're very intelligent, and I would argue they have complex emotions, but how they think about mahouts, I don't know. What I would say is just by looking and observing elephants interact with mahouts, I go back to Pepsi again. Pepsi had a relationship, and I showed this photo, but I kind of moved through it pretty quickly, of a 2-year-old or 3-year-old young girl who was Pepsi's mahout's daughter, who could interact with that elephant in ways that none of us could have. It would have been way too dangerous for us to be jumping on Pepsi's trunk. And so the physical, gentle touching that I would often see between elephants like Pepsi and the families of mahouts, I think indicates to me that there is some level of affection between them. You might even want to say that there is some level of family dynamic there. Certainly elephants in captivity in Thailand and other countries where these are elephants, some of these elephants have never been in the wild. Their only family groups are their mahouts and the mahouts' families.
Yep.
So I think you could make the argument that there is a bond there.
I think, and to anthropomorphize, sorry about this, but I always compare it also to a marriage, basically, but not in that level. But because I guess the other point to make is there are now 3,800 elephants in Thailand alone in captivity. Each has a complex character, and each mahout has a complex character as well. It's very, very difficult to generalize. There are very, very good relationships where you see what Josh has just described, and there are equally bad relationships, and it's the generalizing is dangerous. There certainly is, if you watch, as Josh has said, if you spend time with elephants and mahouts, there are some remarkable relationships based on what would appear to be affection from the elephant. The elephant has no reason to do something when a mahout asks, other than it wants to please the mahout, and that would be through affection and would only respond to a certain mahout as well. So that would be something that, as I say, anecdotally is very, very difficult to generalize, because there are also really not good relationships as well. But yes, I think a bond can be formed.
And I thought another good question from Justin was, what's your main goal in understanding elephant cognition and behavior? Is it mainly to protect the crops and to prevent elephants from entering boundaries of humans?
Thank you for that question. So if I put my psychologist hat on, as a professor at Hunter College in the psychology department, my main motivation when I first started research was to, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, to understand how cognition and intelligence evolves across evolutionarily distant species. So why are there similarities in cognitive ability between elephants and dolphins and corvids like crows, rooks, magpies, and the great apes like chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangs? All these animals that are quite evolutionarily distant from us, and therefore don't likely share an intelligent common ancestor. And so that's one, I think, really strong goal of our research program. But as I said, we also want to take an applied approach here, because what I've found is that trying to solve human-elephant conflict takes a lot of unique multi or interdisciplinary approaches. And that means that trying to take the elephant's perspective, which is what we're trying to do, understand their behavior, understand their decision-making process, so how elephants make decisions about where to go for food, who to go for food with, so their partnership and their family group dynamics. Better understanding this information has the potential to help us come up with better mitigation strategies that, again, take the elephant and the human perspective into account. Now, that might sound very vague, I'll admit that. I mean, I don't think we're at a stage yet where we know what the solutions are that might come from our work. But what we do think is that what a lot of farmers and government officials and colleagues have told us is that we just don't know that much about elephant behavior. We don't know why elephants are raiding crops. We don't know why some mitigation strategies fail so quickly. And we hope that we can contribute to a better understanding of how to help these elephants in that way.
And maybe this, I mean, you pretty much have answered this with what you just said, but maybe you can expand a little bit. Cody had asked, what are some of the next big questions you hope to answer regarding elephant cognition? So maybe if there's one big one that you're excited about.
That's a great question. Because I'm excited by so many, I can't pick one. And if I pick one, then I might upset some of my students who are studying something else. But what I'll say is that I think our attention to questions about how elephants use their sense of smell and their sense of hearing to solve problems, whether they're physical problems or social problems, is really crucially important to not only helping elephants, but in terms of better understanding how to study comparative psychology and comparative cognition. It allows us to start to think about how to design experiments that play to these animals' cognitive strengths. I think for a long time, scientists compared cognition by simply giving different animals primate-specific tasks. If a human child could do it and a chimpanzee could do it, why couldn't an elephant or a dolphin or a bird do it? Well, for one thing, dolphins and elephants don't have hands. Now, elephants have trunks, but they don't work necessarily in the same way as a hand. So we have to try to do a better job, I think, of putting ourselves in the animal's shoes in order to come up with better questions to test them. And that is a big focus of our work.
Great. I don't know if I should keep asking questions. I think we're at 9.
I was going to say, I mean, I'm perfect. We've still got a pretty large crowd in the room who I think probably enjoy watching the elephants, as long as the team in the background is okay with us continuing to answer questions. I'm happy to go. I mean, to keep going.
All right. Well,
Yeah, I can keep going. Just bear in mind my phone might overheat at some point, so we'll go. I'm happy to go until the phone overheats.
Thanks, Sean. It's been a miracle that you've gotten so close and we've gotten such great footage for the last 30 minutes. So thank you.
No problem.
Let's see. I had one, and then we have so many questions coming in that I lost it. So this is an interesting question, I think, about relating humans and elephants. This is from Francesca, asking, as someone who works with children with autism, understanding the sensory relationship on their profiles and how their senses impact their conditioning in certain environments, makes me wonder how taking the elephant sensory perspective into consideration when designing the conditions around your experiments would lead to unknown results. Yes. So how does taking that sensory perspective into consideration lead to something that we can't necessarily relate to, I think is what that.
Yeah, and Francesca, thank you for that fantastic question. And I know Francesca and the great work that she's doing with children with autism. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you guys probably just, that was a trumpet. So one of the elephant's well-known vocalizations that you probably know from TV and movies.
Maybe it's a boat.
Yeah, I think it's definitely.
Yep, it was the boat. It was the boat for sure.
I think that's a really important question. And I think what we're trying to do is to say, can we provide them with tasks that will at the very least give them as much sensory information as we want, as they can have. I think the quantity discrimination test, for instance, was a result we didn't expect. We provided them with sensory information that allowed them to use whatever information or whatever perceptual abilities they had to try to get that information. And it turned out that their olfactory sense was so acute that they were able to make this distinction. So I'm not sure if I'm butchering your question. I apologize, but I think that, to try to predict what the elephants might do with the information we give them is really difficult, but you're right in the sense that we may find out things that we didn't necessarily know before, especially due to the fact that we don't have the olfactory or acoustic sense that the elephants have. So even if we provide them with with an open level, let's say, or a lot of olfactory or acoustic information that gives them the opportunity to solve these tasks, we don't know either A, if we're giving them enough information, or if we're giving them information that we don't even realize we're giving them. So one example of that is, here's a fun fact about elephants. Elephants are able to communicate infrasonically, which means at a very low frequency of sound below that with which we can hear. So these two elephants, for instance, may be communicating with each other right now using infrasonic vocalizations, and we wouldn't know it. So putting yourself in the shoes, as it were, of an elephant, is a lot of fun, but it's also, really difficult because we don't necessarily know everything or hear or see or smell or touch everything the elephant does as well.
Another question from Ashley, asking about whether you've explored elephant spatial memory and how that might have conservation applications. She also wants to know whether you're accepting PhD students for the 2021 year.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so spatial memory is a great question, and it's actually, it's a topic that for those of you that do the simple explanation of spatial memory is do elephants remember, have a memory for where things are, basically. And anecdotally, I think we would be set up really well to test that in elephants, because elephants return to locations they've been where there's been high quality food or high quality water long after they've been there, sometimes weeks, months, even potentially years, which suggests that they have pretty complex spatial memory. The question, and I would be open to anyone's ideas on this, is how we would test that. There are ways that we could do things in captivity, and I've talked to John about this, about hiding food and looking whether or not elephants are able to remember the locations of food that we've hid. But working with elephants is a lot different than working with pigeons or rats, for instance. These are large animals that have a need to do a lot of different things during the day. And so you can imagine memory tasks, which take extended periods of time, can sometimes be difficult to do. As for your interest in being a PhD student, we're always looking. Please feel free to reach out to me by email. I would love to talk to you.
And I'll just add something that may or may not be relevant, Josh. Looking at spatial memory, maybe one of the ways to do it, although it is being done perhaps, but although anecdotally, I guess, is with the approach taken by Save the Elephants and others in Africa, where they are putting the radio and the GPS collars on elephants and seeing them move vast distances, apparently in the right direction, and places that they haven't been for. There's one female group who moved from Samburu to Marsabit, I think, and it's the first time anyone has known a female do that for 20 years, and yet she brought her group there, and that would point to spatial memory. How you test that actually is spatial memory, not following clues on the ground, I don't know, but that's one way to look at it, I would think.
Yeah, I think that's great. And just you reminded me that I should know this, of course, because Satish Venkatesh, who's a master's student in my lab, in collaboration with Schifrin Goldenberg and other people at the Smithsonian, are actually GPS collaring some of the elephants that are solving our puzzle boxes in the Myanmar logging camps. And so when the elephants go out at night, if we see them make a beeline for some of these crop fields, that would also suggest that they have considerable spatial memory capabilities. But how do we test that in a controlled way is an open question. I see a question. It's a question. It goes back almost a half an hour, and it's from Sen Nathan, who is a researcher and a government official working in Sabah. And what's really interesting about what he mentions is citrus plants in Sri Lanka. And I think he was referring to the aversive smells that may be driving elephants away from crops. And that's a great example that we didn't think of.
So I think this is going to be the last question. It came from Cody. What is the most effective way to integrate your research into the way we conserve these species? Is it more effective working with individuals in the community or policymakers and local and state governments?
Thank you. Also, a great question to end on. I think that none of those things work alone. I've told a lot of stories to my friends and colleagues about how incredible the experience of getting to know Thailand and the Thai people has been. But I think a lot of my success working in Thailand and my colleagues and my students' success there has been the relationships I've developed not only with Thai students, but with Thai nonprofit organizations and Thai academics, many of whom have graciously come and joined this talk tonight, but also with government officials and local villagers who are, I would say, in some ways at their wits' end about this conflict and are trying to come up with new solutions to it. And having spent a lot of time there and showing that I'm not there to, impose a Western mentality on what they're doing, but instead to work collaboratively with them to try to come up with a mutually beneficial way of helping not only the people, but also the elephants. So the short answer to your question, if I've gotten to it, is You know, I think all of these things together, learning about the elephants, learning about the people, recognizing and empathizing with the elephants and the people is crucially important to coming up with long-term solutions to this conflict. So I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us for the past hour and a half. This has been an incredible experience. Thank you, Sarah, for the questions. Thank you, John, for bringing the elephants into our homes. If any of you are interested, you can go to GTAEF Helping Elephants on Facebook. John runs these live Facebook videos of the elephants every morning at, I'm going to give the US times, John, 8:30 p.m. in the US and New York. You can follow him on Facebook to get a better view of these elephants. Thank you again to President Raab for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you to all of you for caring about elephants. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.